So I spent last week covering a few key terms, and now I want to get back into Capital is Dead. Is This Something Worse by McKenzie Wark, and talk about what she has going on in chapter 3 here, which is entitled The Forces of Production. One thing I notice in this chapter is that she begins to look more narrowly at a particular kind of worker as the hacker class in this, because she's going to trace the history of the emergence of this class. Another thing I noticed before I get to more of that is this distinction that she begins to develop between vulgar and genteel Marxism. These terms threw me off a little bit because I am not well versed in all the ins and outs and sort of infighting of Marxism. But apparently, quote, vulgar Marxist has been used many times as an insult. I got a little bit of help from this article, 4 Cheers for Vulgarity, that Wark published in 2014 in Public Seminar. And I found this quote, which helps a little bit. I want to look a bit more closely now at how the insult, quote, vulgar Marxist is deployed, and in otherwise not wholly compatible ways, before moving on to 4 lesser known kinds I think worth particular attention in the current conjuncture. I suspect progress in the 21st century might only now be made from the starting points of the various vulgarians who were insulted along the way. All of the various exclusions might point to a door shutting in the face of this or that avatar of the vulgar that needs to be recovered and rethought. It's time, in short, to get our hands dirty, and maybe some other parts as well. That sounds a lot like the same language that she uses more briefly in this book. And notice that for McKenzie Wark, vulgar Marxist is good. It's a good thing. And she's advocating whatever that is to return. And so reading into that article a bit further, I found these clues. That the vulgar Marxist is somebody who hews to this original Marx claim that political change must be preceded by changes in technology. And remember, Marx basically argues that in order for there to be a proletarian revolution, you have to have a full developed proletariat, and that can only happen with changes in technology that socialize production and mechanize it and so on and so forth. So in this case, the vulgar Marxist is somebody who hews pretty close to the original theory of Marx. Maybe not in all respects, but in that respect. So that's a chief theme. The vulgar Marxist wants to work with whatever is available at the time and dwell less on philosophical purity. All right, so I take it that when this term is used against them, it's as in you're not paying enough attention to theory, and you're not concerned about being philosophically accurate as much as you're concerned about the actual forwarding of any sort of working class movement. But as I remember, Marx also basically said, wow, theoretical things are important. Communists are going to work with trade unions and workers in every situation. All right, vulgar Marxists tend to favor gradualism rather than the big leap or revolution. So that's a little different from pure Marx. And it speaks to the pragmatism of this type of person who will, as said before, work with whomever, whenever, and doesn't mind thinking that maybe no revolution, big leap into some completely different thing is necessary, but is willing to entertain the idea that as the forces of production change, they bring about the opportunities for gradual change. Vulgar Marxists pay attention to specialized science and range across disciplines. They're not just into philosophy, in other words, but more importantly, they're into technology. And I think this resonates very deeply with McKenzie Wark, who's very much into technology and very attuned to it and thinks this way. Where is it leading us socially? Where is it leading us politically? Finally, ironically, the vulgar Marxist is accused of being too common, in a sense, to being too close to identification with the working class, and therefore unable to kind of theoretically shape it and lead it. Well, one of the great ironies of this realm of thinking. All right. So in this chapter, she starts talking about where this hacker class emerged, and she locates it more narrowly within the emergence of the scientific class. Okay, so that's something new, because originally in the book, we're all hackers in a way, and we are, but now she's going to go back and she's going to trace how this new class developed, and in the process, show where most of, I think, her hope is centered at the moment anyway. So the first thing she points out is that this scientific worker that emerged didn't fit neatly into either labor or capital. They didn't own the means of production or even control them, controlling the decisions. But they didn't fit the typical definition of labor either, because they were working with their minds and they were working creatively and not so much physically and mechanically. So she says that this is the first glimpse of the emerging hacker class. This is not the class yet, but it's people who have more knowledge and therefore more control over technology. And you get the sense that this, for Wark, means more potential power. They have within their hands a source of power, but it's being siphoned off, or it soon will be. So there was a time when science wasn't really what scientists would even recognize today, but for centuries and centuries, science was much closer to philosophy. And even up to and through the mid-19th century, maybe, I don't know when you would cut this off, but there was this phenomenon, very frequent, of the gentleman scientist, who was really a sort of natural philosopher, and who did this thinking and experimenting to the extent that they did in order to enrich their minds, to blow their minds, to kind of just become more knowledgeable about the world. The scientific class is not that, but emerges from that. That starts to recede as the means of production get more social, as capitalism is on the rise, and you get a type of scientist who works in a lab in some sort of setting where the science is being applied to something concrete, some real objective, but where there's no mechanized control, you might say, or technocratic control that's very heavy of what they're doing. The scientific class emerges thinking of itself as free and as creative and as doing experiments and conducting its own way, okay? And again, this is an experience of freedom and creativity and self-direction that is, a potential source of power. Okay, but then, interestingly, Wark says, the Cold War intervened. She writes, the Cold War left progressive scientists with no choice other than to present themselves as apolitical servants of ethical causes, arguing about good and bad technology rather than forwarding the analysis of the forces of production as a historical agent. So they left off their own futuring, in other words, and it created this situation where scientists might take sides, but also step back from taking direct responsibility for taking sides. So a scientist who worked for the US government to develop nuclear weaponry would probably take an apolitical stance in the sense of, I'm working for the government and I'm giving them information, and I generally support the idea of security, and so they can use it as they see fit. Or a scientist who wants to work for nuclear power, who may object to nuclear weapons, says, I'm still doing my science for the sake of that effort. I will let others decide, right? This was a maneuver that I take it many scientists made. So then Wark talks about how the hacker class finally officially emerges. The hacker class emerges when scientific form making can get extracted fully from the scientists themselves. Okay, so extracted, I take it, by government, which we just kind of described, and by corporations. And so the scientist becomes an employee and somebody who isn't really supposed to be and doesn't engage in thinking about the creative potential of the science and technology they're developing, but rather does what they're told. And at this point in time, then, and going along with that comes the vectoralist class, which imposes that control on the scientific class or the hacker class. All right, so Wark introduces or reintroduces this idea of the general intellect here. So then Wark introduces or reintroduces this idea of the general intellect, which I kind of talked about a little bit last time, and I'll tie in here. So the general intellect represents increasingly sophisticated technology that increases the social nature and potential of knowledge, meaning that we have put a lot of, quote, dead labor into the development of technology to get it to the point where basically it encompasses what we can do collectively. And this goes along with the way we produce now. We tend not to think of it this way because it's ideologically incorrect, but basically we have socialized people more and more by the way that they work. And so an example of that, which we are all very familiar with, is how interchangeable people are in a lot of workplaces. So if you work at this fulfillment center, for instance, you can get there, you can in 1 hour be trained to follow directions on your device and to become a part of this machinery. If you're working at McDonald's, it doesn't take too long to train you because the screen that you actually help the customer place the order on gives you the pictures and the choices that you need. In other words, technology has been used to greatly ease our labor, not just our physical labor, but our mental labor. And while this may make us maybe a little intellectually lazy, it also makes it extremely easy for people to be plugged into the way things are produced now. So information technology and the increasing socialization of labor and life indicate for Wark that the private property economy is being superseded technologically. I think this is really key. This is where she's headed, is that we have brought things to such a pass that the way that we produce things and the way that we think about producing things is so socialized that the private property form seems from a certain vantage point to be antiquated, or in fact holding it back and maybe using it wrongly. So I'm going to leave you with this concept from chapter 3, Technocratic Enclosure. It's the idea of humans enclosing other human beings with intellectual property. This is how the private property form in Wark's view continues to hold sway, is through intellectual property law. So proprietary technology can hem in human beings' choices and freedom, right? If you want a Big Mac, you can get a Big Mac 2 or 3 different ways. There's only so many ways this person can punch the button. You're not going to be able to get a Big Mac medium rare. Not going to happen. But it does make things easier. So Wark is, I think, heading towards this idea that the vectoralist class is trying to, through intellectual property law, through political control more largely, to retain its control over what has become basically a very socialized and mechanized process that implies that fewer people need to labor at all.